No one noticed her at first. That wasn't unusual. Danielle Walker had learned over the years how easily she could move through rooms like this without being seen. Elegant rooms, expensive rooms, rooms filled with people who mistook confidence for importance and noise for power. She stood just inside the entrance of the ballroom, the soft music washing over her, crystal glasses clinking somewhere behind her. The air smelled of polished wood, expensive perfume, and quiet ambition. It was a celebration, one of those carefully curated corporate events where nothing was accidental. The lighting was warm but controlled, the decor minimalist but costly. Every detail screamed success. Danielle adjusted the strap of her small black purse on her shoulder and took a slow breath. She hadn't planned to come. In fact, she had been very clearly told not to. "You don't need to be there," her husband had said earlier that week, his voice dismissive, distracted. "It's just a work thing. You wouldn't know anyone." That should have been her first warning. But something in his tone, the way he avoided her eyes, the way his answers came too quickly, had settled uneasily in her chest. Danielle wasn't a suspicious woman by nature. She believed in trust, in privacy, in giving people space, but she also believed in patterns. And lately, the pattern was silence. So here she was. Danielle scanned the room. Executives clustered in small groups, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Servers moved gracefully between guests, trays balanced perfectly in practiced hands. A string quartet played near the far wall, their presence more symbolic than functional. She smoothed the fabric of her dress. Simple. Black. Elegant. No labels screaming for attention, the kind of dress you wore when you didn't need to prove anything. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stepped further inside. That's when she saw him. Evan Walker stood near the center of the room, perfectly at ease, a glass of champagne in his hand. His tailored suit fit him exactly the way success had begun to fit him over the past 2 years. He was laughing, openly, freely, the kind of laugh Danielle hadn't heard at home in months. And beside him stood a woman Danielle had never seen before. She was white, tall, blonde, dressed in a bold red gown that demanded attention. Her hand rested lightly on Evan's arm, fingers curled in a way that suggested familiarity, ownership even. Danielle stopped walking. The room seemed to tilt just slightly. At first, she thought she must be mistaken. Maybe it was a colleague, a client, a friend's partner. But then Evan leaned closer to the woman, whispering something in her ear. The woman laughed and tilted her head back. Danielle felt the shift then, not shock, recognition, the kind that comes when your body understands something your mind is still trying to deny. She watched as Evan guided the woman toward another group, introduced her with an open palm and a proud smile. "This is Claire," he said, his voice carrying easily through the small circle of listeners. "She's very special to me." Danielle's heart beat once, hard. No one looked her way. Not one person in that circle noticed the black woman standing less than 20 feet away, watching her husband introduce another woman as if his wife did not exist. Claire smiled graciously, accepting compliments, laughter, attention. Danielle stood still. This wasn't an accident. This was a performance, and she was not part of the script. A server passed by, offering champagne. Danielle shook her head politely. Her mind raced, but her face remained calm. Years of restraint had taught her how to hold herself together when everything inside wanted to scream. She could leave. That would be easy. Slip out quietly, preserve dignity, confront him later, in private. That was what people expected her to do. But something stopped her. Not anger, not jealousy. Something deeper. Resolve. She had spent too long shrinking herself for other people's comfort, too long being the invisible support behind someone else's ambition. Tonight, She wouldn't cause a scene, but she also wouldn't disappear. Danielle moved toward the far side of the room and took a seat near the wall, positioning herself where she could see everything without being seen. Across the room, Evan continued to shine. He didn't look in her direction, not once. Claire laughed again, touching his arm as if it belonged there. Guests leaned in, clearly impressed. Danielle listened. "Evan's been incredible," Claire was saying. "He's really made a name for himself." Danielle almost smiled. She knew exactly how Evan had made that name. She knew the late nights, the sacrifices, the early investments that had nearly wiped out her savings, the introductions she had made quietly, without asking for credit. But that story wasn't being told tonight. Another voice cut through the room, confident, authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The chatter softened. Heads turned toward the stage near the front. Danielle straightened slightly. The host continued, "Tonight, we're not just celebrating another successful year. We're honoring the people behind it." A ripple of anticipation spread through the room. Danielle's gaze flicked back to Evan. He looked pleased. Too pleased. He had always loved applause, even when it wasn't meant for him. The host smiled. "And before we begin," he said, "I'd like to acknowledge someone very important who joined us this evening." Danielle felt it then, a subtle tightening in the room. Something was about to shift. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she knew this night wasn't over, and neither was she. The host's voice lingered in the air for a moment, but the room didn't fully quiet. People shifted. Glasses clinked. Conversations resumed in low tones, as if no one wanted to be the first to pay full attention. Danielle stayed seated. She crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, and folded her hands in her lap. Her posture was calm, composed. Anyone watching would have assumed she belonged exactly where she was. Evan still hadn't seen her. He stood with Claire now near the bar, laughing with two senior partners from his firm. Danielle recognized them immediately, men who had shaken her hand years ago at quieter dinners, men who had looked past her then too. One of them raised an eyebrow, glancing around the room. "So," he said to Evan, loud enough for others to hear, "you finally decided to upgrade your +1? Laughter followed. Not roaring laughter, the polite kind, the kind that pretends it isn't cruel. Claire smiled, unfazed, leaning closer to Evan as if the comment were a compliment. Evan laughed too. "Let's just say I've been expanding my horizons," he replied. Danielle felt the words land in her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She watched. Another woman, a guest in a pale blue dress, glanced at Danielle briefly, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. She leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered something. They both looked back at Danielle. Confusion flickered across their faces. Danielle met their gaze calmly, then looked away. Across the room, the host tried again. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." This time, the chatter faded more completely. Evan lifted his glass and kissed Claire lightly on the cheek. Danielle saw it all, not the kiss, the ease, the certainty with which he acted as if he were untouchable, as if the room belonged to him. The host continued, "Tonight is about recognizing excellence, leadership, and partnership." Danielle almost laughed at that. Partnership. The word felt heavy with irony. She remembered sitting at their kitchen table years ago, spreadsheets spread out between them, Evan pacing nervously as she reassured him that the risk was worth it, that he was capable, that she believed in him. She remembered signing documents she barely understood because she trusted him. And now he stood 10 feet away, pretending she was invisible. The host gestured toward the crowd. "We're honored to have several key contributors with us tonight," he said. some familiar faces, and some we don't see often enough. Evan straightened slightly. Claire followed his gaze toward the stage, curiosity bright in her eyes. Danielle leaned back in her chair. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. A server passed by and accidentally brushed Evan's arm. "Oh, sorry," the server said quickly. Evan waved it off impatiently. Claire leaned toward him and whispered something. Evan chuckled. Danielle didn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She had heard that tone before. Dismissive, superior, safe. The kind of tone people use when they believe no consequences are coming. The host paused, scanning the room. "There is one person in particular," he said slowly, "whose presence tonight deserves special recognition." A hush fell over the ballroom. Danielle felt her pulse quicken. Evan smiled broadly, clearly assuming the attention was moving in his direction. He adjusted his jacket, handed his glass to Claire, and shifted his stance slightly forward. Claire squeezed his arm. The host smiled. "She's someone whose work rarely happens on stages like this," he continued. "Someone whose influence is felt more than it's seen." Evan's smile faltered, just a little. Danielle inhaled quietly. The host went on, "Many of you have benefited from her insight without ever knowing her name." Now people were paying attention. Heads turned, brows furrowed. Danielle felt the room tightening around a single point. Still, no one looked at her. Evan glanced around, confusion creeping into his expression. The host's voice grew warmer. "She didn't ask to be acknowledged," he said. "In fact, she often avoids the spotlight entirely." Danielle closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them. Across the room, Claire tilted her head, sensing something was off. Evan laughed nervously. "This is unexpected," he murmured. The host cleared his throat. "But tonight," he said, "we felt it was time." Danielle's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. Not from fear, from readiness. The room held its breath. And somewhere between the chandeliers and the polished marble floor, the balance of power began to shift. The silence in the room stretched longer than expected. People shifted uncomfortably now, sensing that the host's words were leading somewhere unfamiliar, the kind of place where assumptions become dangerous. Evan glanced at Claire again. "Relax," he whispered, forcing a smile. "Probably some donor or consultant." Claire nodded, but her confidence had softened. Danielle watched them both. She noticed how Evan's posture changed, how his shoulders squared as if preparing to receive praise that hadn't yet arrived. He had always done that when he thought recognition was coming. A small tell, one she knew better than anyone. Behind her, two women spoke in hushed tones. "Do you know who he's with?" one asked quietly. "No," the other replied, "but I thought he was married." Danielle didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The host took a step forward, glancing down at the card in his hand. "Some of you may not recognize her," he said, "and that's understandable." Evan let out a small laugh. He raised his glass slightly, gesturing toward the stage. "Whoever she is," he said, casually to the group around him, "I hope she doesn't mind not being the center of attention. Some people are more comfortable in the background." The words drifted farther than he intended. A few heads turned, not many, but enough. Danielle felt the impact of them land, not because they hurt, but because they revealed something ugly and undeniable, the kind of arrogance that only grows when it's never challenged. Claire laughed softly, touching Evan's arm again. "She sounds mysterious," she said. "I love that." Danielle exhaled slowly. She could have stood up right then. She could have walked across the room, looked him in the eye, and ended the performance in seconds. But that wasn't how this was going to happen. Not tonight. Tonight, the truth would arrive on its own. Near the stage, a man in a dark suit leaned toward the host and whispered something urgently. The host's eyebrows lifted. He nodded once, then looked back at the crowd. "Yes," the host said, adjusting the microphone. "In fact, she specifically asked not to be introduced." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Evan frowned. Danielle felt it. The moment his confidence cracked. The host continued, "She believes the work should always matter more than the recognition." Someone near the front murmured, "That's rare." Another voice added, "That's powerful." Evan shifted uncomfortably. Danielle recognized the look now, confusion giving way to unease. He scanned the room again, more carefully. This time, his eyes passed over her once, didn't stop, moved on. Danielle remained still, invisible, but not insignificant. Claire leaned closer to him. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. Evan forced a smile. "Of course," he said. "Just trying to figure out who they're talking about." The host's voice softened. "Some of you have sat across from her in meetings," he said. "Some of you have approved proposals she designed, and some of you have built entire projects using frameworks she created." The murmurs grew louder now. Executives exchanged glances, brows furrowed. Danielle noticed a man near the bar, older, silver-haired, slowly straighten. His eyes narrowed as if a realization had just struck him. He looked directly at her. This time he didn't look away. Danielle met his gaze calmly. Recognition flickered across his face. Shock, then respect. He leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something urgently. She followed his line of sight. Her expression changed. Instantly. Across the room, Evan laughed again, too loudly. "Well," he said, raising his glass, "whoever she is, I hope she enjoys the applause." Danielle felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. That laugh, that was the mistake, because now the room was beginning to understand, and once people see the truth, they don't forget who tried to hide it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It moved quietly, almost politely through the room. A conversation paused mid-sentence. A laugh ended too, quickly. A group subtly rearranged itself. Danielle felt it before she saw it. She noticed the way the energy no longer flowed toward Evan. How people who had surrounded him minutes earlier now drifted a few steps away, as if unconsciously making space. Not around him, around her. She remained seated, calm, unreadable. Across the room, the silver-haired man approached the host again, speaking in low, urgent tones. The host listened carefully this time, nodding more than once. Claire sensed it, too. Her smile tightened as she looked around, noticing the change in attention. The admiring glances she'd enjoyed earlier had softened, replaced by something closer to evaluation. She leaned toward Evan. "People are staring," she whispered. Evan chuckled, trying to sound relaxed. "They're always staring," he said. "This crowd lives for gossip." But his eyes betrayed him. He followed Claire's gaze, and for the first time, truly looked around the room. He noticed the distance, the empty space, the conversations that stopped when he joined them. He frowned. "Strange night," he muttered. Danielle watched him carefully. She recognized that moment too. The instant someone realizes they're no longer in control, but doesn't yet know why. A woman in a navy dress approached Danielle hesitantly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you Danielle Walker?" Danielle looked up at her, composed. "Yes," she replied. The woman's eyes widened just slightly. "Oh," she said. "I thought so." She smiled politely, then excused herself, already pulling out her phone as she walked away. Danielle didn't follow her with her eyes. She didn't need to. The room was speaking for her now. Near the bar, Claire's posture stiffened. "Why did that woman just talk to you?" she asked Evan sharply. "I don't know," Evan replied, irritation creeping into his voice. Maybe she thought she recognized her. Claire's jaw tightened. "You said no one would know her," she said. Evan bristled. "I said she wouldn't know anyone," he snapped. "That's different." The words hung between them. Across the room, two executives whispered urgently. "That's her," one said. "No, really?" the other replied. "Yes. I saw her name on the filings." Evan caught fragments of conversation now, names, projects, numbers, words that didn't make sense together. Until suddenly, they did. He looked back at Danielle again. This time, his gaze lingered. Recognition flickered at the edge of his mind, but pride pushed it away. Not her, he told himself. She wouldn't be here. Not like this. Claire crossed her arms. "Evan," she said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, the host returned to the microphone. The room fell silent. Not politely this time, expectantly. Danielle felt the air tighten around her. The host smiled, but now the smile carried weight. "There's someone here tonight," he said, "whose presence reminds us that leadership doesn't always announce itself." Evan's throat went dry. The host continued. "Sometimes it waits patiently until the moment demands it." Danielle rose from her chair, slowly, deliberately. The movement was subtle, but it rippled through the room like electricity. Heads turned, Claire's eyes widened, Evan froze, and in that moment, before a single name was spoken, everyone understood. Danielle stood with her shoulders relaxed, her chin level. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked forward with the calm certainty of someone who had never needed permission to belong. The host stepped slightly aside, giving her space without a word. That gesture alone sent a message through the room. Danielle stopped a few feet from the stage. The silence was absolute now. No glasses clinking, no whispers, no music. Evan felt his heartbeat in his ears. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. The host cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please allow me to formally recognize Danielle Walker." The name echoed, not loudly but decisively. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Danielle Walker. Executives straightened. A few guests nodded slowly. Someone near the back whispered, "Of course." Evan's face drained of color. Danielle Walker. The name finally landed where it belonged, in his chest, heavy and undeniable. The host continued, "Danielle is the principal architect behind the strategic framework that transformed our expansion over the last 3 years." A stunned silence followed. Claire turned sharply toward Evan. "You said," she began. Evan couldn't speak. The host wasn't finished. "She advised multiple mergers, designed the operational models many of you rely on, and declined public recognition at every stage." Danielle's gaze never left the room, not Evan. The room, because this wasn't personal, it was factual. "And tonight," the host added, "we are honored by her presence." Applause began slowly, scattered at first, then stronger, more confident, until the room filled with it. Evan stood frozen. The sound felt unreal, like it was happening in another room. Claire's hand slipped from his arm. She took a step back, her expression tightening into something brittle. "You told me she didn't matter," she whispered. Evan swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I didn't think, you didn't think she'd be here," Claire said flatly. Around them, people had begun to move. Not toward Evan, away from him. Danielle stepped closer to the microphone. She didn't smile. She didn't look angry. She looked composed, grounded. "I didn't come tonight to be recognized," she said calmly. "I came because this work matters." Her voice was steady, clear. And because the people behind it matter too. She paused, not for effect, for truth. I've always believed that leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest, she continued. It's about who stays accountable when no one is watching. Evan closed his eyes briefly. Too late. Danielle glanced toward him just once, not with anger, with finality. The room followed her gaze. All eyes turned, and in that moment, Evan understood. The humiliation he had so casually inflicted had come back wearing dignity. The applause faded slowly, like a wave retreating from shore. No one rushed back into conversation. No one laughed. The room stayed still, suspended in the weight of what had just been revealed. Evan finally moved, not forward, backward, just one step, enough to break the illusion that he belonged at the center of anything. Claire stood beside him, rigid, her face carefully neutral, but the confidence she had worn so easily earlier was gone, replaced by calculation. She looked at Danielle again, really looked this time, and for the first time that night, she understood. This wasn't a woman being ignored. This was a woman who had been choosing silence. Danielle adjusted the microphone slightly, then released it, deciding she didn't need it after all. She spoke without amplification. The room leaned in. I want to be clear, Danielle said calmly. This isn't about embarrassment or revenge. Evan swallowed. It's about respect, she continued, and the cost of pretending someone doesn't exist. She paused, letting the words settle. I've spent years supporting work that carries other people's names, she said, not because I had to, because I believed in it. Her gaze moved slowly across the room. I believed in partnership, she said, in integrity, in truth. A murmur of agreement passed through. The crowd. Evan felt it. The room aligning against him without accusation, without shouting, just judgment. Claire broke the silence. You never said she was your wife, she said quietly, not to Danielle, but to Evan. The words were sharp, precise. Evan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Danielle didn't look at Claire. She didn't need to. I didn't come here to explain my personal life, Danielle said. I came to finish a chapter. That caught Evan's attention. He looked up sharply. Danielle met his eyes now for the first time all evening, not with fury, with clarity. Some stories, she said, end the moment the truth is spoken. She stepped back from the stage. The host nodded respectfully. Executives began to approach her, slowly, carefully, not to congratulate but to acknowledge. A man extended his hand. Thank you, he said, for what you built. Danielle shook it once, firmly. Behind her, Evan stood alone. People passed him without looking. Claire picked up her purse. I think I'll go, she said flatly. Evan didn't stop her. He couldn't. The doors closed behind her with a soft finality. Danielle felt it then, not triumph, not relief, but release. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't defended herself. She had simply stood still long enough for the truth to arrive. And now the night was hers to leave. But not before one last choice, because how you walk away matters just as much as how you arrive. Danielle walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The cool night air met her skin as the doors closed behind her, muting the music, the voices, the spectacle she had just left behind. Outside, the city hummed softly, cars passing, distant laughter, life continuing as if nothing monumental had happened inside those walls. She stood still for a moment, not to breathe, to feel. Then she heard footsteps, measured, hesitant. She didn't turn around. I didn't know you were coming, Evan said behind her. His voice lacked the confidence it once carried. It sounded smaller now, stripped of performance. Danielle faced forward. I know, she replied calmly. Silence stretched between them. Evan stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the walls could still hear him. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said. Danielle exhaled softly. "It happened exactly the way it needed to," she said. He ran a hand through his hair. "You embarrassed me in there," he said quietly. That was the moment. Danielle turned, not sharply, deliberately. "I didn't say your name," she said. "I didn't tell anyone what you did. I didn't raise my voice." Her eyes met his. "If you felt embarrassed," she continued, "it's because the truth finally caught up with you." Evan swallowed. "I made a mistake," he said. "Things got complicated." Danielle's expression didn't change. "No," she said, "things got convenient." The word hit harder than any accusation. "I built my life around us," she continued, "around what we were supposed to be, and somewhere along the way you decided I was invisible." "That's not true," Evan protested weakly. "You introduced another woman as very special," Danielle said evenly, "while pretending you didn't know me." Evan looked away. The city lights reflected in his eyes, restless. "I didn't think you'd walk into that room," he admitted. Danielle nodded slowly. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You thought I wouldn't show up. You thought I wouldn't matter." She stepped closer. "I mattered long before. Tonight," she said, "you just stopped seeing it." Evan's shoulders sagged. "I don't want to lose everything," he said. Danielle considered him for a moment, then spoke the words he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. "You already did," she said. The weight of it settled between them, not dramatic, inevitable. She turned toward the street. "Danielle," Evan said quickly, "what happens now?" She paused, not because she was unsure, because she wanted him to hear it clearly. "Now," she said, "you live with the version of yourself you showed the world tonight." She walked away, and for the first time, Evan understood something far more frightening than public humiliation. He had lost her, not in anger, but in clarity. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No headlines waited for Danielle when she woke up. No messages demanding explanations. No public fallout splashed across screens. Just quiet, the kind that comes after something ends for good. She stood by the window of her apartment, the one she'd moved into years before marrying Evan, the one she'd never quite let go of, watching the city wake up. Sunlight reflected off glass buildings, traffic moved steadily, people hurried somewhere important. Life continued, as it always did. Her phone buzzed once on the table behind her. She didn't rush to check it. She already knew what it would be, Evan's name. She left it there. At the firm, the atmosphere shifted quickly, not dramatically, professionally. Executives who had once deferred to Evan began redirecting emails. Meetings were rescheduled, decisions postponed. No one said why. They didn't have to. Word travels fast in rooms where power lives. Danielle received 3 messages before noon. Not apologies, acknowledgements. One from a board member she hadn't spoken to in years. One from a former colleague who suddenly remembered her contributions. One invitation to lunch, carefully worded, respectful. She declined them all, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. She wasn't interested in being rediscovered. She had never been lost. Across town, Evan sat alone in his office, staring at a screen he couldn't focus on. Claire hadn't responded to his messages. Colleagues avoided his door. A promotion that had once felt inevitable now hovered uncertainly just out of reach. The confidence that had carried him through rooms now felt fragile, borrowed. That night, Danielle met an old friend for dinner. Someone who knew her before titles and investments and sacrifice. "You okay?" her friend asked gently. Danielle smiled. "Yes," she said, and meant it. Because for the first time in a long time, She wasn't carrying someone else's weight. She walked home later under streetlights, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She felt lighter, not because nothing had been lost, but because something had been returned. Herself. At home, she opened her laptop and pulled up documents she hadn't touched in months. Projects she'd postponed, ideas she'd shelved. She worked late into the night, not to prove anything, to build again on her own terms. The next day, she sent one email, short, clear, professional. It went to Evan. "I'll be filing the paperwork tomorrow. Please don't contact me again." She closed her laptop and didn't look back. Some endings don't need arguments. They just need honesty. And as Danielle turned off the light, she knew something important. The room might have seen her that night, but she had finally seen herself. 6 months passed, not quietly, just privately. Danielle didn't announce her departure. She didn't post cryptic messages or explain herself to people who had never bothered to ask who she was before that night. She worked. She rebuilt. She chose carefully. The consulting firm she launched was small at first, intentional, selective, no loud branding, no grand promises, just results. Clients came through referrals, not Evan's network, but her own. People who knew her work, who respected her. Boundaries, who didn't mistake her calm for submission. She set rules early. No meetings that went past respect, no partnerships without transparency, no silence where honesty was required. Her calendar filled faster than she expected. Meanwhile, Evan's world narrowed. The promotion never came. It wasn't denied, just indefinitely delayed. The kind of professional limbo that doesn't make headlines, but slowly erodes confidence. People still spoke to him, just not the same way. He noticed how often conversations ended early, how often decisions were made without him, how rarely his name came up in rooms where it once carried weight. The difference was subtle, but relentless. One afternoon, Danielle received an invitation to speak at a closed executive forum, small audience, high stakes. She accepted. When she walked into the room, heads turned, not in surprise but recognition. The host introduced her simply. "This is Danielle Walker," he said. "She's here because she knows how to build things that last." Danielle spoke for 40 minutes, about leadership without ego, about partnership without ownership, about power that doesn't need permission. No one asked about her marriage. No one needed to. Across town, Evan watched the clip later that night, muted. He recognized her voice immediately, not because it was louder than before, because it was freer. Danielle returned home that evening, kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of water. She stood by the window. Again, same city, same lights, different woman. She thought briefly of the ballroom, the chandeliers, the moment everything shifted, not with anger, with gratitude, because humiliation only works when you believe the lie it tries to tell you. She never had. And that was the truth no one could take from her. Years later, people would still talk about that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remember. They wouldn't remember the music, or the decor, or the champagne. They would remember the silence, the moment when a room full of powerful people realized they had overlooked the most powerful person among them. Danielle never told the story herself. She didn't need to. It lived in the way she walked into rooms now, unannounced, unafraid, unbothered. In the way people listened when she spoke, in the way no one questioned her presence again. She had learned something that night. That dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't beg, it doesn't chase validation. It waits. And when the truth arrives, dignity stands still and lets the world adjust around it. Evan never truly recovered. Not because he was punished publicly, but because he was exposed privately. To himself. He had mistaken access for worth, visibility for value, control for respect. And once those illusions cracked, there was nothing left to hide behind. Danielle, on the other hand, gained something far more permanent than revenge. She gained clarity. She learned that silence isn't weakness when it's chosen, that patience isn't submission when it's intentional, and that being unseen doesn't mean being unimportant. Some people only see you when the room tells them to. Others never need permission. That night, Danielle didn't reclaim her power. She revealed it, and the room had no choice but to listen. If you've ever been ignored in a room you helped build, if you've ever been made invisible while others took credit, if you've ever been underestimated because you chose dignity over noise, this story was for you, because the most dangerous thing you can do to people who underestimate you is let them, until the moment they can't anymore. If this story spoke to something you've lived or something you witnessed, leave a comment below. Your story deserves to be heard, and if you believe in stories that begin in silence and end in truth, subscribe. This is the Unheard.